Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Community Reads 2021. It's brought to you by Friends of the Aptos Library. This is Memories, My Brother, a Quilt, and the AIDS Project. To join this event using a telephone only, dial any of the following numbers, and I'll read two of them aloud. 1-888-788-0099 or 1-833-548-0282, and then slowly enter the webinar ID of 920-7068-6595. The passcode is 2021-0221. As an attendee, your microphone is muted for the entire presentation. We are not taking open mic comments. However, you do not need a microphone, camera, or a screen if you only want to listen to the presentation, as it is accessible by landline or mobile phone. We are taking questions or comments. If you're joining by a computer, you may use the Q&A feature to type your comments. On the attendee control bar, near the bottom of the screen, you'll see the Q&A icon. If you're using a mobile device, the Q&A icon likely appears near the top right corner of the screen. Once the event begins, if you're joining by computer, to see all panelists, you may need to use the Zoom control bar and select Gallery View. Depending on the size of your mobile device screen, you may need to scroll over to view whoever is speaking. If you're accessing this meeting via a Chromebook or web browser only, you may not see all panelists at one time, only the panelists speaking. I'll now hand things over to Denise Ward. Denise, over to you.
Good evening and welcome. Tonight is going to be a very personal and intimate talk with Dinah Davis, along with our own friend member, Kris Franceschi. This event is something I've really been looking forward to since I was introduced to Dinah a few months ago. And I'm just really pleased that she so graciously agreed to do this with us. We hope that you've had a chance to see some of the other events that we've had so far to celebrate the novel, The Great Believers. If you'd like to see more programming like this and to support our community reads, please visit fscpl.org/OCR to make a donation. Before we get into the discussion, we're going to play a short video for you that sets the stage for this event. If you have any difficulties playing this video, which could happen, so don't get frustrated, just come back in 5 minutes and join the discussion. And you'll be able to watch this video in your own time by going to the Friends of the Aptos website. There's a link there for you. It's really highly recommended that you see this video. It's really fabulous. It's a quick look into the AIDS Project and the AIDS Memorial Quilt. So we hope that you'll enjoy it and the rest of tonight's event. Thanks so much for coming.
I talked about this idea for a whole year and everybody told me it was the stupidest thing they'd ever heard of. But I ignored them and kept going and found people who shared the vision, and it ended up becoming, I believe, the world's largest community arts project ever.
A quilt commemorating
I talked about this idea for a whole year and everybody told me it was the stupidest thing they'd ever heard of. But I ignored them and kept going and found people who shared the vision, and it ended up becoming, I believe, the world's largest community arts project ever.
A quilt commemorating 40,000 people who've died from AIDS has gone on display in Washington.
Quilts traditionally were made from cast-offs, taking scraps of fabric that are of different colors and different textures and sewing them into something that is warm and comforting. I thought it would be good therapy for people who were deep in grief. I thought of it also as a tool to help the media understand that behind all of those horrendous statistics were actual human beings that were part of families and communities and neighborhoods. But I was never really prepared for the sheer beauty of it. In the early 1970s, I was one of many thousands of young gay and lesbian kids who got here any way we could. Of course, at that time, it was still a felony to be gay in this country. It was still a felony in California. So we lived under a great deal of repression and fear.
I think, you know, this idea that gays are going to take over city government, I think it's amusing when I hear that.
There were a few blocks within the city where we could be completely free and be ourselves, and that meant you could hold hands with your partner, you could kiss. To come here and to find this vibrant, welcoming community was incredibly exciting.
In 1981, American doctors were baffled by a bizarre disease. Within 6 years, AIDS has spread to 71 countries and infected up to 10 million people.
We're filming this interview at a restaurant called Catch at the corner of Castro and Market Street. I was living just a couple of blocks here when I read those first stories about this new disease. That was the summer of 1982. By the fall of 1985, almost everyone I knew was dead or dying. We very quickly came to understand the signs. People who just a few weeks or months before had been athletic and healthy were suddenly getting these purple lesions. People began to get skinny. We saw people die all around us. On one block in my neighborhood, everybody died in the span of 2 years. Ultimately, over 20,000 gay men would die in this neighborhood. I actually acquired the virus in the winter of 1978, 1979. I did not begin to show signs of that infection until 1992. I got very, very sick very, very quickly and came close to dying in 1994 before I got access to one of the very first clinical trials. I admit there are days when I still feel just overwhelmed by grief. I miss my friends. I miss them a lot. I barely passed high school biology, but I understood clearly that there was no such thing as a gay virus, and that what we were experiencing here was going to be experienced by all sorts of different kinds of people all around the planet. I remember one day exclaiming in rage to my friend, you know, if this was a meadow with 1,000 corpses rotting in the sun, then people would look at this, they would see it. So each panel is 3 feet by 6 feet, the approximate size of a grave. And that was deliberate. I wanted to show how much land would be covered if all of these bodies were lined up head to toe. By October 11th of 1987, we had collected 1,920 individual panels, and they were placed on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., and ended up on the front page of just about every newspaper in the world. Once people could see what I was talking about, then they kind of got the power of it. This quilt is a pretty extraordinary testament to what we went through, and it's a place that's known for its monuments. They're made out of stone and steel, and we took a monument there that was made of cloth and thread and sewn by ordinary Americans and people from all over this planet who loved someone who died of AIDS and wanted them to be remembered. It was that simple and that amazing.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kris Franceschi from the Aptos Friends. I really just love that video. It's so powerful. I think it's a very potent reminder of how loss and grief and love all merged and manifested in an astonishing way that became the quilt. It's a lasting tribute to all those who died, and it makes visible forever the enormity of the impact that AIDS had on so many lives around our country. I'm here tonight with Dinah Davis. I'm looking forward to seeing her photos and her impressions of the quilt. and to hearing the story of how AIDS affected her own family very directly. Dinah is a retired educator with a PhD in counseling psychology, and she recently wrote her first book. The book tells the story of her parents and their lives raising their 3 children. And they moved around from state to state while their dad was in the Navy. And then they became, as their dad became a minister, they moved around with him then too. Their youngest son, Kurt, who was Dinah's brother, was born in Brisbane, Arizona in 1955. We'll get to know him better through her program tonight. Before Kurt died of AIDS at the young age of 33, his travels as an entertainer took him to all sorts of major cities around the United States and traveled throughout the world. Dinah's going to share personal stories of her brother Kurt, showing photos, sharing anecdotes, and newspaper articles that were saved from the 1980s during the AIDS crisis. She'll also share a writing from her son, who was Kurt's beloved nephew. Go ahead, Dinah.
Thank you, Kris.
Mm-hmm.
Cleve was such an important part of the early days of AIDS in this country. We owe him a debt of gratitude for conceiving of a way to memorialize the quilt, to memorialize our lost family members, and being able to contribute something that we could visit, and not only our own lost loved one, but those of friends that we have known and other members. Part of today's presentation that I'm going to provide includes pictures of both of the panels created to honor my brother. As of 2018, 700,000 people have died of AIDS. Today, I'd like to put a face on one of those victims. This first picture is of my brother. It's taken from a award that he won. No, he didn't win. It's taken from an award that was placed up in one of the theaters that he had been such a big part of in Bakersfield. And later I'll show you the plaque that went underneath that. Because I feel that it's important for you to get to know Kurt as we knew him before he got sick, I'm going to begin by sharing a few pictures from his early years. We were a typical 50s family in this picture with Kurt right in the center. He was born November 2nd, 1955 in Bisbee, Arizona, way down almost on the Mexican border. He began entertaining our family and the neighborhood kids at a very early age. In this picture, the next picture, he's about 3 years old. We had moved to Oahu, Hawaii, and his first instrument was a small ukulele, which he would pretend to play and make up songs for us. Kurt loved being on the stage and never swayed from his dream of entertaining professionally. He attended Bakersfield High School in California's Central Valley, participating in school plays, musicals, and marching band. He sang, danced, and acted his way into the hearts of the city, and was recognized in the community for his acting and singing skills. He played a variety of roles in both the Bakersfield Community Theater and the Bakersfield Civic Light Opera Company. In the spring, upon graduation from Bakersfield High School, he chose to continue his education at LA City College, which had a well-known performance arts department. Here he's supposed to be playing an old man in one of their productions. I thought he looked like a teenager dressed up for a Halloween party. I was 9 years older than Kurt and often felt like a young aunt, more than his older sister. Mom and I shared parenting duties and we both spoiled him. By the time he left for Los Angeles at the age of 18, I was already married with 2 young sons. Like Fiona in The Great Believers, I loved my talented brother and his delightful group of friends, male and female. He usually brought one or more of them home with him on holidays, so they all became part of our extended family. If we were able, family members would travel to attend whatever production in which he was performing, including driving to Chicago in the early 80s when he was part of the traveling cast of Oklahoma, starring John Davidson. Since it was in the summer, my sons and I drove to South Dakota to pick up my grandmother and then joined my brother-in-law and brother and sister-in-law from Indiana in a wonderful trip to see Kurt's performance. Kurt also appeared in a few TV programs and starred in stage shows on various cruise lines sailing to Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. Our parents were able to sail with him on a trip to Europe on one of his cruises, not long before our father died of cancer in 1985. This picture is of Kurt and my grandmother. As often as we could, we would drive down to Long Beach and meet him at the harbor there when he came in, or see him off when he left. He was usually laden with gifts and stories of all the exotic places he had visited. My brother Frank and Kurt and I were always very close. We all loved singing and dancing and just being together, which was more difficult as we got older and lived in different parts of the country. I remember one time when we were all together celebrating a birthday at a local Bakersfield restaurant, which had a small dance floor and great music. No one else was using it, so my brothers and I got up and took it over and danced and laughed and reveled at just being able to be together. That didn't happen very often once we all went and separated in different parts of the country. In the spring of 1988, my partner and I attended a conference in Los Angeles. Kurt, who was living in Hollywood at the time, asked if he could meet us in the lobby of the conference center. After making sure we were in a somewhat secluded area, Kurt told us that he was HIV positive. I need to change my glasses. We kind of took a deep breath. This plague had been going around the country, had been in the news, but we never thought that it would touch our family. And we were so naive, like many other families at that time. The next hurdle was telling our mother together. She had lost her husband and mother in the last few years and now would be faced with the prospect of losing her youngest child. She was always an emotional person, but once she got past being shocked and devastated, she immediately went about gathering as much information as she could. She did all kinds of research. She was so strong. I had no idea that she had saved all of this research until I began looking through some of her old files. She reached out to other mothers of AIDS children when she learned that there was a support group available. She contacted everyone she could to get information, as much as was available in Kern County at the time, which wasn't a lot. Kurt did well for about a year. He continued working, watching his diet, and meditating to manage the stress. Eventually, he was placed on AZT, which was one of the few drugs available at that time, but the side effects were often debilitating. He would go off of it for a while so that he could have a few days of feeling like his old self, but he continued to get sicker and sicker. Major clinical trials were just starting out. Unfortunately, he just missed out being a part of them. The emotional toll of knowing he was probably not going to get better, plus the fact that he was losing so many of his city friends, resulted in his moving back to Bakersfield to be closer to his family and old friends. He got a small apartment not too far from where our mother lived and found a job as director of a couple of plays with the Bakersfield Community Theater. He also became active in AIDS education, speaking at local schools, businesses, and community organizations. During the late 80s, Cal State University Bakersfield, CSUB, hosted a workshop on in-home care for caregivers of people with AIDS. It was the first workshop of its kind in Kern County. Dr. Kathleen Ritter, coordinator of the master's degree in counseling at CSUB, listened as families shared their feelings of devastation, loss, and fear with her and each other. Quoting from her, she said, "Sometimes it isn't even the dying that's so bad. It's the getting there. There's the fear that there's also just the incredible loss." Dr. Ritter had also been my mentor when I got my master's at CSUB, and I was sorry to read about her death in 2019. She had been a wonderful advocate for AIDS patients and their families. This plaque which I think will come up here in a second, was part of a commemorative award which hung in the lobby of the Bakersfield Community Theater in honor of his activism in educating the community about AIDS. And you can see what it says there. He did have a lot of compassion, and he became a very large part of in the schools and community and even businesses going around and explaining what the disease was about, what it wasn't about, and how it wasn't as dangerous for the vast majority of people as they believed it was. The following are various articles and documents on AIDS from the 80s through the 90s, all of which have been saved by my mother. Some are defining what AIDS stands for, such as this one right here, how it's not spread by casual contact. You can't get it from swimming in a pool with other people, from just touching things, even a toilet seat. You can't get it by hugging someone or shaking hands or just being in the same room with them. No one had ever been infected by an insect bite. These are just some of the rumors that went around during that time. There was always this misinformation that came out, just like there is today with with COVID, excuse me. Some are ways of helping family and friends of AIDS patients know more about it. One shows Dianne Feinstein in Parade magazine in 1988 at the end of her tenure as mayor of San Francisco. She was one of the first politicians to work on the epidemic's front lines and knew more about the subject than any politician in the rest of the country. She's quoted as saying, "The spread of AIDS is not going to be in the big cities in the future. It's going to be in the towns and rural areas of this country. As we know now, it not only spread to small towns, it also spread to heterosexuals, hemophiliacs, and children born to infected mothers." This letter right here was written to my mother, whose name was Fane, by the president of MAP, which was Mothers of AIDS Patients. And this mother is writing to thank my mother for asking for information, of reaching out for help. Some boys aren't so lucky, she said, and many weren't. Many, unfortunately, for the young men, their parents had already disowned them, didn't want to have anything to do with them, were mad just because they were gay, let alone the fact that they were sick of this horrible disease. In 1988, our family decided to do something different for Christmas. Traveling from California, Indiana, and Arizona, we rented some rooms at the Rosarita Beach Resort in Baja, California, where the weather was milder at the time of that year. There were no Christmas trees available, so we found a broom, a big broom, an old-fashioned broom, and I guess we brought some lights, or we bought them locally. We strung them around this tree and kind of connected it to some chairs so it was in the shape of a tree, and that's what we celebrated with. We had also brought our gifts with us, and we had a wonderful time at that time, just being together. And I'm going to ask Sarah to kind of fast forward. There's a picture from that time. There's the Dianne Feinstein article from 1988. The next one, they actually sent the virus on a trip in the Discovery to see how the protein in it would react in the atmosphere and space. That was just one of the many different types of research that they did during that time. This one shows, they call it the leprosy of the 90s. They finally realized that it wasn't just gays and drug users who could acquire this. This particular article tells about a newlywed couple who ended up both getting the AIDS virus, and it quickly spread and reached out to women and children And it was indiscriminate for a number of different reasons. In the summer of 1989, Kurt and I flew to Pierre, South Dakota. My uncle, oh, let me get to this. Dr. Fauci, I've got an quote from him at the end here, was also very invested and did a lot of reaching out to people during that time. Look how young he is here. He says, if you can't tell if someone has been infected by the AIDS virus by looking at him or her, but you aren't in danger of getting the disease unless you engage in risky behavior. So what he did was, like he does now, telling people, you probably won't get COVID if you wear your masks, you distance yourself, you wash your hands. Back then, he was telling people they need to wear condoms and they need to exchange needles if they're drug users. And if that message probably would have gotten out a lot earlier, maybe a lot more people would have been saved. Excuse me just a minute. I wanted to finish this about my brother and going to South Dakota. In 1988, this was in July, in the summer of, 1989, Kurt and I flew to Pierre, South Dakota, where my grandmother had lived, but she had already passed away. My uncle, her son, was getting married again after being a widower for many years, and Kurt had been invited to sing at their wedding. He was not strong enough to travel alone, so I accompanied him, making sure his supply of AZT was kept cool and safe. He did get up and sing in that packed church, and they did know that he had AIDS. And he did an absolutely amazing job of singing for my aunt and uncle, and I was so proud of him, especially because only 2 months later, at the beginning of October, when Kurt had just attended the opening night of his second production, he collapsed on the way back to his car. A family member drove him to Midway Hospital. If you can show the picture about Midway Hospital. Yeah. Oh, there we are in Rosarito Beach. This was all the family that attended. I'm taking the picture, so I'm not in there, but it was a wonderful time for us to be together. Kurt is here on the right side. Midway Hospital was where he went. He had been there before when he had gotten sick when he was living in LA, and felt very comfortable with all of the staff there. They had a lot of experience treating AIDS patients. So after he collapsed in Bakersfield, and this is where he was driven, the very next day, I lived in Fresno at the time, but the very next day I packed a bag and I drove down to Bakersfield to be with my brother. Unfortunately, I had to leave, but before I did, the hospital was so wonderful. They allowed me to be in the room with Kurt. They put a cot in there for me. So for the next week, I was able to spend a week there with him playing cards, watching TV comedies, laughing, memories, just being together. One night, I was in bed. It was probably 2 or 3 in the morning. And I was awakened by Kurt's cry and saw that he was vomiting blood. I called the nurses. He was given an endoscopy the next morning. His lungs were giving out and he was only barely conscious. Unfortunately, I had caught the flu bug in the hospital and was told that I had to leave. I hated leaving him. I didn't want to leave him, but my mother and other family members were at the hospital by then, and they had almost shoved me out of the door. Mom convinced me that I had to go home and get well before I could return. The next day, some of Kurt's friends from New York City flew out to be with him also, and were with him when he died 3 days later on October 10th, 1989. I was devastated that I wasn't with him at the end. He had been a bright light in all our lives and left a huge hole that has never quite been filled since. When I read about a quilt being compiled and made up of personal stories of people lost to AIDS, I hired someone to design a quilt panel for my brother. His New York friends also made one for him, and both panels ended up being displayed in the same section. This is what we used. This shows how we had to design it, 3 feet by 6 feet, as Cleve said, and what we could put on it, the materials. And it was such a help to be able to have this and to be able to submit it. The panel, all the panels went to San Francisco at that time. That's still where they keep them. This was the one that we designed for Kurt. If I can make that a little larger. Is it possible to make that a little larger, Sarah? Or can you possibly read what it says at the top?
Sure. At the top it says, "Time will tell what the reason could be why so many wonderful people had to leave our world. Until then, we hold each other and live in joy and with the energy of God."
Thank you. And Kurt's picture is there in the center, and around him are photos of friends and family that loved him. He was a dancer. He loved to dance. He loved music. He loved life. And so this design was honoring that in him. The next one, I believe, shows the panel. Well, that's my partner and I at the time looking, standing beside it when it was in Fresno. It was also shown in Bakersfield. The sweatshirt that I have on there says, "Remember their names" on it. That's okay, you could go on. The Best of Times, Kurt Davis. The Best of Times was the name of a catering business that he did in between gigs, so to speak, and performances. And so this was also a wonderful memorial for him. And they ended up, as I said, being shown next to each other on the section of the quilt that was together whenever it was shown. As I said, I was teaching in Fresno at the time. I don't know if I said I was teaching, but I was living in Fresno at the time and teaching at Fresno High School. I was also advisor of the peer counseling class. And we were invited to volunteer when the AIDS quilt was being presented at Selland Arena, which is the big place where we had concerts and everything there. And of course, my brother's quilt was there also. The kids, they were all high school, juniors and seniors, wanted desperately, they really wanted to be part of this. They were excited about being part of it. I had to get permission from all their parents, and all except one gave that permission. The one that didn't, unfortunately, was a colleague of mine at Fresno High whose daughter was in the program. And he was very adamant that he did not want his daughter to attend, be anywhere near the AIDS quilt display, because he felt that it was just going to be full of queers, which I thought was sad, and the girl was very disappointed. Most of the attendees were friends, families, community members. It was very quiet when you walked around. There was maybe a little talk, but it was just quiet. People were walking around and making comments and some crying. There were boxes of tissue, usually on the floor, that you could use and pick up. They anticipated that it was kind of a very sad, not kind of, it was a very sad event for many people. By 1989, there were hundreds of names. This was when Kurt died. This, where his quilt was shown in 1990. My family were all able to view a few sections of the quilt when it was displayed in either Fresno or Bakersfield. Some of us also flew to Washington, D.C. when it was shown there, the entire quilt on the greenway between the Capitol building and the Washington Monument. This particular, I had something written down about that, but it tells here that few people talked. It's a moving experience coming here. It goes beyond race, creed, or anything else. And I would add to that, beyond caste. And those of you who have read that book will understand what I mean by that. My two sons, Lance and Scott Randolph, I think we have a picture of them viewing the quilt also. Oh, Sarah, would you read that, please? This was a teenager from Bakersfield College, wrote an article. He was sent as a teen reporter to the quilt. And this is what he said.
He said, many people probably think that reporters have no feeling when they cover the news. No matter how tragic it may be, it's what they do for a living. I was covering the visit of the Names Project AIDS Memorial Quilt 2 weekends ago for the Bakersfield College Renegade RIP. What I was required to do was interview people at the display and get their reactions to it. The quilt will have a profound effect on anyone who visits a display of it. What covered the floor and the walls of the Bakersfield College gym was only 7% of the entire quilt, which is composed of more than 12,000 squares. When I saw the 832 squares at BC, I still thought, quote, my God, all those people, end quote. That's when I put down my notebook, stopped being a reporter, and started being a sympathetic ear. That's what my visit to the quilt did for me. That's Tuesday, October 2nd, 1990, Devin Rambo, Bakersfield College.
Thank you, Sarah. I'd like to move on to, if we can find it, by the way, there's the quilt, as Cleve showed in the video in Washington, D.C. Another time when it was shown, you could actually walk along in between there. So it wasn't shown in DC once, it was shown 2 or 3 times. And each time was so much larger than the last time. This was a letter from, at the time, one of the publishers of the Bakersfield Californian. And he had been a friend of Kurt's. He had attended many of his performances locally. And after Kurt passed away in 1990, he donated $20,000, I think it's 20, maybe it was $25,000 to the Kern County AIDS Project to help them in their work in helping families with AIDS and patients with AIDS. There hadn't been an awful lot done in Kern County before that time. It's kind of hit and miss, but once the quilt came out, it made a huge difference, especially after people saw it. They wanted to help. This is, on the left is my youngest son, Scott. And on the right is my oldest son, Lance. And they were about, I'd say 15 and 17 maybe at that time. And we're signing at each showing of the quilt, they would have a large sheet out on the floor, and maybe more than one. And you could sign personally names, remembrances, anything you wanted, you know, within reason. But, and so we had all signed that. It was very moving. This is my boys today. My boys, my beautiful young men that loved their Uncle Kurt. They learned so much from him. So what I'm going to do is when he moved back, when Kurt moved back, when he got sick, since they lived in Bakersfield, they were all able to spend much more time together. It was a good learning time for them. No, I'd like to stay on the, yeah, right there for a few minutes. Since he had moved back to Bakersfield, they'd been able to spend more time with him. They were both teenagers at the time and were devastated to lose him. Today, they are 48 and 50 and remember the wisdom and strength they learned from their uncle. My eldest son regrets that his wife and children were never able to meet Kurt. He knows his own two sons would have benefited from Kurt's wisdom and ability to connect with people from all walks of life. Scott, my youngest son, wrote a letter to share with you regarding his thoughts about his uncle. I'm going to read it to you. I'm going to try to make it all the way through. I've had a hard time so far, but it says, my Uncle Kurt. In the mid-'80s, my Uncle Kurt was diagnosed with AIDS. But long before that, he was more than just a member of an exclusive group that was vilified out of fear and ignorance. He was one of the most amazing men I'd ever met. Kurt could do anything that a young boy like myself dreamed about doing someday. He was an amazing singer, dancer, and actor, so worldly and cosmopolitan, having lived and thrived in both New York City and Hollywood, and seemed to have the world at his feet. I marveled when I saw him for the first time on television and knew that I wanted to be just like him one day. We knew that my Uncle Kurt was gay, and unlike the more open-minded society we live in now, it was very rare to have a relative that was as out of the closet as he was. My brother and I knew more than most of our friends what being gay meant, and more importantly, what it didn't mean. There was no fear from us of who he was or what he would do. He was and always would be our awesome Uncle Kurt. He loved my brother Lance and me. He would always make time to see us and take us on grand adventures. Up until his passing in 1989, we had the chance to witness a remarkable man and a wonderful life right before our eyes. Lance and I often talk about how great it would be to have him in our lives today, to share his life with our children and live mostly vicariously through his larger than life stories and travels. One day, my brother and I went to visit our grandma Fane. Kurt was in town and he wanted to talk with us about something important. We were in the main room of the house, just us three, and he asked us if we knew anything about AIDS. We told him what we had heard, which was a mixture of myths and tall tales about mosquitoes and toilet seats, and something having to do with kissing in French. He calmly let us know that he had tested positive for HIV and explained what that meant. He told us that he was taking medications that were helping him fight the disease. He told us that he would be fine and that nothing about his relationship with us would need to change. We couldn't catch it from hugging him or being around him, and all the myths we had heard about it were simply not true. The best part about him telling us personally was that we took his word as gospel. If our Uncle Kurt said he was okay to hug and be around, then we knew for certain that it was the truth. My fear of the disease diminished immediately, and we had no doubt that our Uncle Kurt would beat this disease because he could do anything. He smiled at us both and gave us a big hug. A few months after that talk with us, I went on my annual pilgrimage to Pilgrim Pines summer camp for a week away from family and some time with old friends. Scott doesn't say it here, but I believe maybe he was a counselor at the camp that year. I had, as always, a great time hiking, singing, and camping, and as the week wound down, our counselor said the whole camp was going to the main hall to hear a guest speaker. Our cabin was the last to enter the hall, which by then was completely filled with over 200 kids ages 8 to 18. On the stage was a single bar stool with a man sitting on it. He looked like he was in his late 20s and seemed a bit sullen. The room got quiet, and he began to tell us his story. He had been a camper at Pilgrim Pines himself years before, and he had experienced some of the best summers of his life there. He talked slowly, and although he was a gifted storyteller, he seemed weak and much older than he looked. As his story unfolded, he discussed the day he discovered that he was HIV positive. As soon as the words left his lips, you could feel a shift in the room. As I looked around the room, you could sense the fear and uncertainty on people's faces. It was almost palpable. He continued his story, but from that point on, I don't think anyone heard him at all. The emotion in the room was overwhelming, and it felt as though if he had tried to move towards us, most of the kids would have run from the room in terror. I was filled with so many emotions at that moment. Initially, I felt sorry for him, up there all alone with a deadly disease coursing through him, while people looked at him as if he were the plague incarnate. But my feelings began to shift, and as he finished his story and asked if anyone had any questions, I knew what I had to do. As he looked around the room for raised hands and saw none, the sense of discomfort began to grow. You could tell that everyone simply wanted to get up and leave, to get away from that guy with the AIDS. I waited a moment longer, hoping that someone else, anyone else, would have the courage to raise their hand, but no one did. So I stood up from my seat and raised my hand high, feeling emboldened by the not too distant words from my uncle. When he saw me, his face seemed to light up, thankful that at least someone had a question to ask. He asked me, "Yes, what's your question?" And I said as loud as I could muster with 200 pairs of eyes on me, "Would you mind if I gave you a hug?" His eyes grew very large, and I heard at least a handful of kids next to me gasp. He paused for quite a long time and then softly said, "Of course." I slowly made my way up the center aisle toward the stage, heads turning as they watched me ascend the stage steps. As I came closer to the man who remained seated as I approached, I saw something I hadn't noticed on my way up. There were tears in his eyes. I leaned in and hugged him just as I hugged my Uncle Kurt that day a few months earlier. As we hugged each other, he very quietly whispered into my ear, "Thank you so much." I simply said, "You're welcome." After that, it was as though the floodgates opened and many other students raised their hands with questions, and some even came up after the talk to hug him as well. I felt wonderful. And I knew that if it wasn't for my Uncle Kurt, no one in that room would know that the person on the stage that day wasn't some plague-filled death bringer, but a man, a scared and uncertain man that still needed to be loved and seen as more than just the disease raging inside of him, a man that, like all of us, simply needed a hug. These are my sons today, and I am so extremely proud of both of them. They never shied away from their Uncle Kurt, no matter how sick, how ill he got. And they shared that knowledge with their friends also. Many of Kurt's friends who passed away did not have the support system from their families that my brother did. We supported them as much as we could. And they were always included in around our table. Too many pages here, I'm sorry. And I'm also kind of emotional. We had friends in Bakersfield, Fresno, LA, who lost their battles with AIDS. And one of the last pictures shows a friend that we lost. He lived in Los Angeles. He was a friend of Kurt's and mine and my partner's at the time. He was a beautiful man and a dear friend. He died of AIDS 1 month after this picture was taken. As you can see, AIDS patients didn't always look sick. Some did. Some had other problems with AIDS that didn't necessarily show outwardly. Kurt was loved and supported totally, but still only lived for 18 months after being diagnosed. There was no vaccine, and the drugs available worked with some people, but not others. As Dr. Fauci today implores us to use masks and distance, he implored people in the 80s to use condoms and clean needles. But at the beginning, many didn't think that would apply to them, and especially heterosexual couples who weren't used to wearing condoms if they were married, but unfortunately, sometimes they needed to. I hope we have learned from the past to protect ourselves and our loved ones and never take a single life for granted. I miss Kurt every day and would give anything in the world to have one more day with him. And the last picture is one more picture of Kurt. I love you, honey, and I always will, and I miss you constantly. One more dance. Thank you so much for appearing with us today. And I have one question, wanting to know if I had a support group during this time other than my family. Yes, had a lot of friends that were ill, and we all had kind of had a support group, not just of patients, but my church especially. I was a member of Wesley Methodist in Fresno at the time, and I had belonged to First Congregational Church. I'm going to put my regular glasses back on, excuse me. And they were wonderful. You know, they weren't afraid either. It was amazing. My part of the support was the fact that everyone was very well known in my family at that time. My father was a minister, but even after he retired, he worked as an associate pastor at First Congregational Church in Bakersfield, and started the first Alzheimer's daycare center in Bakersfield. And so he was fairly well known from that standpoint. My mother was very active in Democratic politics at the time, and so people knew her from that. She was also a teacher. My ex-husband was very active in education in the area and in Republican politics. So we had kind of both political sides covered. A lot of people didn't have that. That was just something that maybe was unique to our family. It didn't matter. There were still so many people who did not want to have anything to do with someone who had AIDS. So many young people that were abandoned by their families. I think that's all I want to say right now. One of the questions is, Kurt died many years ago. What's the current status now for those with AIDS? There are still people dying every year, sometimes up to 40,000. There is no vaccine. I got my second COVID vaccine this morning, and I thank God that I got that. But my brother didn't get a vaccine. AIDS patients today still do not get a vaccine. Fortunately, with all of the trials and studies that were done, they've come up with much better medications and drugs that can help prolong life. As Cleve said, he was able to be part of a study in the 90s where it showed that he was able to be saved by that. Kurt died in '89, just kind of missed that. Kris, did you want to say something? I see you up there.
Oh, I just came back on. So I'm wondering if there are other questions from our audience. If so, if you could enter them into your little Zoom bar there using the little Q&A thing. see if there's another one. Yeah, someone thanking you for sharing the story. Absolutely.
I appreciate that very much. Thank you for listening. And
I would just like to remark also, Dinah, if there's not other questions, that I'm just really struck by how much love there is that endures. You all endured so much loss in losing your brother, and losing, you know, your mom losing her son, and your sons losing their beloved uncle. And yet there's just so much love that seems to endure, that you and your sons share. And I'm just amazed that you all carry that forward, and that you surrounded Kurt then with that. And I have some questions too, for my own self, a little bit more about the community. Like, I'm from up here in Santa Cruz County. And so I'll just speak for myself. I have kind of a prejudice, and I imagine some other folks from Santa Cruz might carry it too, that we think of Kern County, and especially back in the 80s, as being ultra conservative, and that it would have been harshly judgmental, and it would have been hard for you to find support. Why do you think the community was accepting and supportive, even during at that time when so many others and other communities misunderstood and were just scared witless about it and didn't provide support?
thank you, Kris. One reason, as I said, was many people knew my particular family, but that Kurt was just one of many AIDS patients that lived in Kern County. Mm-hmm. Not as many as in other areas of the state, but being as conservative as it was, I don't think it was as much then as it is now, but that's my opinion.
Another assumption I was making that's wrong.
So they had, there was an AIDS hotline set up so people could call in. As I mentioned, Dr. Ritter did AIDS workshops in various places. I also worked with the American Red Cross doing AIDS outreach, mostly after Kurt died, but I continued doing that because there continued to be such a fear. But yeah, I was immensely pleased. Everyone, because Kurt had gone to high school there, graduated, when you're a performer, you're out in the world. Yeah. You know, he did live performances. He competed. He marched in the school band. He was in musicals. You know, Bakersfield Civic Light Opera Association. He played, I think, Peter in Jesus Christ Superstar. He was a scarecrow in The Wizard of Oz. I mean, all these things. And people just kind of fell in love with him. So they knew him as that person. Yeah. Not as the sick person. He was sick for a total of 18 months of his life. But he had been a wonderful son, father, friend. Not, he wasn't a father, son, a friend.
Yeah.
Uncle. Before that. Yeah.
Well, I'm so glad he had so much support, largely because of who he was and your family. It is heartbreaking to consider that so many other people who died from AIDS, especially in the beginning, mostly young men, and their families didn't receive that kind of support, but yours did. I see there's a bunch of other questions. I didn't know if Sarah's going to read them to you or if you're just going to answer them.
Sure, I can read them. It says, I know Pilgrim Pines, if you're a congregationalist, did your faith help you at that time?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I would go there quite often when I took my kids or my own kids or my brother. I loved it. And my faith is very strong. And Kurt's was too, our whole family. I mean, my dad was a pastor, so we grew up with that, but we didn't take it for granted. And it wasn't the kind of fire and brimstone that some, I don't know. My dad and mother believed that everyone was equal, that we all believed that we all deserved love. And my dad used to work at one point as a chaplain for the Red Cross when we lived in Wyoming, which I didn't mention. And he would always be bringing people home that were homeless or whatever had happened to them and needed a place to stay for a day or so, or would call ahead and tell mom to put a few more plates on for dinner. That's the way we grew up learning about that. And that was our faith. And it's gotten, I think if it hadn't been for my faith, my mother losing her husband, her mother, and her youngest son within like 6 or 8 years would have killed her. Her grief was immense, but she also had a very strong faith. Thank you for that question.
Thank you for your response, Dinah. The next question says, where are the quilt sections displayed today?
They're not displayed unless someone calls and requests a group of panels or a section to be sent to them. They're in San Francisco, and they are stored there. So if you wanted to see a particular one, you could either go there and ask if you knew the number, but you'd have to give them quite a bit of notice. But there's also an interactive age display that you can look online and find the whole quilt. So that might be a possibility.
And then someone else would like to know more about your book.
My book was about the life of my parents and our family, but mostly the history of my family immigrating to this country, going way back to when they first came to America. And then it goes all the way up through my parents' deaths. And it does touch on Kurt's getting AIDS and his death. But that's one part of it. If I wrote a book about Kurt's life with all he had, I think it'd be a bestseller. Yeah, he had quite the adventurous life. And we loved it because like the boys, I said, I mean, he was always bringing home things. I still have them in my home to this day. The wonderful gifts he brought back from India or Africa or Scandinavia, Russia. I mean, he just went every place. We loved it. So.
And then your next question says, have you read the book, The Great Believers? And if
Yes.
so, would you please comment on your thoughts about the book?
This was, Great Believers was based in Chicago with a group of young men there who were friends and one by one started acquiring, becoming sick. And the one that I related to the most, which I thought I didn't miss that whole page, I guess, but anyway, was Fiona and her brother and their relationship and how she felt when he died. And she kind of became big sister to so many of the other young men. And I still am in contact with many of Kurt's friends that are still alive, that did make it. Yes, I loved the book. And it helped. It helped me put in perspective, not because the ones I knew were in San Francisco, LA, and New York, and Chicago was just a different area, but so much was similar about it. Yeah.
And then there's another question. It says, do you know if the sections of the quilt are shown during AIDS Awareness Month in December? And I'll put up the interactive AIDS quilt website.
I don't know, but I would hope it was.
So you can go to aidsmemorial.org, and it's an
Right.
interactive AIDS quilt, and you can type in the name or the block number, and it zooms in on each of the panels that you're looking for.
One of the panels that Sarah showed up there, the second one of my brother's, she was able to pull off of this interactive display, which was amazing to me what technology can do. And she's fabulous, but she pulled that right up, and that's how we were able to show that one. These were both on the interactive display, but I had a copy of this one, but I didn't have a copy of the other one. And now I do, thanks to her. Thank you, Sarah.
And let's see, you have oh, that's the end of the questions. If any members of our audience have any questions, you'll just use the Q&A icon. It's down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You'll see a little Zoom control bar that says mute, start video, and then, or you won't see start video, I'm sorry, but you'll see Q&A icon, and that's where you would type it in. And if you're on a mobile device, it's up at the top.
See, so I can't really tell. Are there any more questions, Sarah?
I don't think so.
There are not. No, there are no open questions at this time.
Okay. All right. Anything else you'd like to say? Ms. Dinah, that was amazing.
Thank you to all of those who did turn in, and to my two beautiful sons and their families.
Absolutely. I think I'm in love with your guys, your Kurt and your Lance and your Scott. Amazing. Yeah. The love living through your family it's a beautiful thing, even though this is such a sad and painful experience you've been through. There's just something really special about it that I'm sure everybody watching and listening tonight experienced that with you. So thank you very much, Dinah. And this does bring us then to the end of our time together tonight. Thank you, Dinah, again, for putting together this discussion. Thanks to the library, to Sarah, Denise, and all the friends for hosting the event. And of course, a big thank you to all of you, our audience, for being here with us tonight. We do also have one final event coming up in our Community Reads 2021 calendar. It's happening on March 4th. You don't want to miss it. It's with Dr. Ronald Haddis, who is Secretary of the Beyond's Aid Foundation. He's going to discuss the history of the AIDS pandemic in detail and the commonalities that the AIDS pandemic has with our own COVID-19 pandemic now. We hope to see you all then, and please be well and stay safe. And thank you very much for your participation.